My name is Paul Wicks and I'm a neuropsychologist by training. I started out my research career investigating cognitive aspects of motor neuron disease, or ALS as it's known in the States. And at the same time, in the early 2000s, the internet was growing, was becoming more of a widespread thing, not just for sort of hobbyists and academics, but was becoming more widely used. And so in 2002, I took over the running of a website at King's College Hospital called Building User Involvement in Motor Neuron Disease. And that project had been set up by a nurse as a research project to try and gather more patient input about how we could improve the services that we were offering at the hospital. And they tried a variety of different ways of engaging. So there were real-world support groups, there was a newsletter, there was a phone line, and there was the online message board. And actually it was the online message board that proved the most sustainable over time. So when the research funding came to an end, they were looking for volunteers to sort of keep it running to some extent, and we had two young onset people with that disease, just in their 20s, talking to one another. And I knew a little bit about the web at the time, so I thought, well, I'll take over and volunteer. So in my evenings, I would moderate this website, and people would ask questions like, why do we have to have placebo in randomized control trials? And I was just a student, so I didn't know. So I would go and ask the head of clinical trials, she would tell me, and I would tell them. And so I ended up becoming the sort of translation layer between medical science and the sort of patient understanding. And so that's something that I've continued with to this day. So back in about 2005, 2006, when Patients Like Me was just being started, it was started by a family affected by ALS, motor neuron disease, and they were trying to come up with ways to help their brother, Stephen Hayward, who was diagnosed with the disease when he was quite young, he was about 29. And so rather than just trying to rely on the evidence base, which was very thin, particularly around symptom management, to say, well, what antidepressant should we use, or what treatment should we use for saliva? Rather than have just trial and error, what if people shared their experiences to say, well, this dosage of amitriptyline worked really well for excessive saliva, but it also caused constipation. If people could share that information systematically, then perhaps we could do research with it, perhaps we do scientific analysis. So some of the users of Build were the beta testers of Patients Like Me, and it was through that I came into contact with that family, the Hayward family, and I reached out to them and said what an interesting idea I thought this was, and they asked if I would moderate their forum. So I took what I've been doing in the UK and translated it over to Patients Like Me more globally. So that was that first condition, and we give people the opportunity to measure their condition by giving them patient-reported outcome measures, letting them track their treatments against that, and that's prescription treatments, supplements, over-the-counter exercises, the symptoms that they're experiencing either through their disease, or they can add other diseases, other symptoms. And then they can also add lab measures, so things like their forced vital capacity or blood tests or things like this. And the real difference between a system like Patients Like Me and, say, a clinical registry is that all the members of the system can see all of the data of everybody else. So if you think of a personal health record that was online, say it might be between you and your doctor, or if you think of something like LinkedIn, you have to give permission before two profiles can connect. Well, it's not like that on Patients Like Me. On our system, everybody can see everybody else's data. So it's a very different approach that talks more about sort of openness and sharing than privacy and protection. And so what that allows is much more rapid research, more rapid discovery. And because we're asking the questions in a scientifically rigorous way, in the same way that I used to go and see people with a scientific protocol, we build that into the website to say, well, what are the right questions to ask? What are the meaningful questions that patients can answer about their condition? Versus what are things to which they don't have insight into. You don't know your blood pressure right now, but you know how tired you are. So, we have to focus what are the right questions that we can ask, and what's really relevant for your condition. There's patient-centered research, which I think takes the existing research infrastructure and brings patients in. So it says, we're going to do an observational study, we're going to do a clinical trial, but we're going to set up a patient advisory board. We're going to come and have selected members with this condition or caregivers to come and comment and give us advice on different things, to say, well, what are the most important research questions here, or do people really understand this outcome measure, or how can we make sure we communicate things clearly? And I think that's very important, and I think that's long overdue. Participant-led research is slightly different. That's saying, no, we're not going to use the existing infrastructure of research like hospitals and trained scientists and what have you. We're going to take some of those skills and transfer them over to the participants themselves. So one example of that would be the lithium study that was conducted in about 2008, 2009 by a group of people affected by ALS, motor neuron disease. And they were responding to a clinical trial which had come out and been published in the peer-reviewed literature in PNAS by an Italian group who claimed that lithium carbonate, a drug frequently used for the treatment of bipolar disorder, would halt or significantly delay the progression of this rapidly fatal, incurable disease. The title of the paper even said, lithium carbonate delays amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And members of our site translated the abstract out of the original Italian using Google Translate. And they were already trying to work out the best protocol for getting hold of this drug before the medical research establishment even had read the published findings. So what ended up happening was, in the original Italian study, they had got 16 patients treated with lithium carbonate, and they compared those to 28 controls who weren't taking it. Within about 6 months, we had 160 patients who'd got hold of lithium off-label. So that's 10 times the sample in the published literature. And led by a Brazilian patient, Humberto, and a caregiver in the States called Karen, they started crowdsourcing the data. One of the oddities about that disease is that the rating scale that's used in clinical trials can also be self-reported, and the correlations between the clinician interview and the patient self-report is very high. It's above 0.9. So what that means is that patients have access to almost the same quality resolution of information, of measurement, that the doctors do. And so they started using Google spreadsheets to all say, well, I got hold of lithium from my GP, who wrote me a prescription, and here's what my functional rating score was before I started, and here's what it is every month since. And they added a field for dosage and side effects and all this kind of stuff. And they started running statistical tests on it. So Karen had a PhD in geology, which is not a medical science, but it's still a science. And so she was running t-tests to see, well, here are the people that are self-reporting that they're taking lithium, and then let's take a look at a control sample that are not. And I think this raises a number of interesting questions. But one thing that I think can't be overlooked is that the members, the patients, the participants, were asking many of the right questions. They were analysing the original study that had been published in PNAS, and saying, well, I'm not sure about the confidence intervals on this graph, or, well, what was the dosage here, or, was this the right statistical test that they used, and was this single-blinded or double-blinded? They were picking the study apart just like a peer reviewer would, and I think we often don't give participants and patients enough credit for being able to do that. In the end, what happened was that we upgraded our platform on PatientsLikeMe to allow people to more systematically measure these things. So we could break out not just the total score, but also the component items. We could more rigorously capture longitudinal data over time, and we could capture data in a way that was probably a bit more robust than Google spreadsheets, which is a bit more open. But we had a dialogue open with the community the whole time about where we were in the analysis. People gave us suggestions. When it came time even to publish the paper, we published it open access so that all the members of the community could read it. And another thing we did was we actually uploaded the entire de-identified data set to the community. So if other people wanted to take that data and reanalyze it, they could. They were also showing some signs then of perhaps rebelling against the system. People with HIV in clinical trials would sometimes register at multiple clinics to try and make sure they were getting treatment, not placebo. Sometimes they would even meet up in person and swap pills. They would have pill parties so that people would get equal chances of placebo and treatment. And I think what that was an early indication of was that the medical establishment thinks that the purpose of a trial is to learn something, whereas many patients think the purpose of a trial is to get better. And when these two things come into conflict, there's some tension there. And what the internet and some of the tools that technology have allowed is for the patients to actually get more on parity with the medical establishment. If they have access to some of the same tools, if they can start using some of those skills which they can increasingly teach themselves through online courses, through Wikipedia, through reading open access publications, the same journals that the doctors read are now being read by the patients, then I think we have to react to that. Otherwise, there are some risks that if we don't react to that and we don't build constructive ways in which we can harness this energy, it'll actually backfire. It'll actually be counterproductive for both patients and for the research field. So I think relative to our understanding of ethics as they exist in the developed world, in response to the Declaration of Helsinki, the Nuremberg trials and the Belmont report, I think participant-led research turns a bit of that on its head. Those reports and those ethical rules assume that there is such a thing as a researcher and such a thing as a participant, and that there's never a situation in which one person can be both things. I think it assumes an imbalance of power where one person knows more than the other, has access to more social capital, and somehow controls the other person more. I think there's a lot of stuff in there around protection of prisoners, of vulnerable people, that sort of thing. And it doesn't really take into account what can happen when people themselves that have a condition want to self-experiment. And so I think we really need to think of how a sort of co-production model of research is different here. I don't think there are any easy answers, but for instance, in the lithium study, one of the main people who was proposing that patients do it was a patient living in Brazil using Google Translate to communicate with English-speaking people around the world. Well, which IRB, which ethics committee is responsible for that? Lithium carbonate at the time was generic. It was made by dozens of manufacturers and it cost pennies. Is there a manufacturer that should take responsibility for this? Was the responsibility for each individual patient down to the doctor who wrote the prescription because they were off-label prescriptions? Does some responsibility lie with PatientsLikeMe as a place that collected the data and published the research? I think that's all unclear. But I think until the sort of research establishment has sort of more of a discussion about this, we're not really sure where to go. I think what you can't do is close it all down. You can't say, put the genie back in the bottle, because if it wasn't PatientsLikeMe, it would be Google, or it would be Twitter, or it would be Facebook. You can run participant-led research over the telephone. The medium is not the issue here. The issue is this sort of social activation that's occurred and the really simple group formation that social media allows. Unfortunately, sometimes these things get tested when things go wrong. And so we've been very carefully keeping an eye on other experiments that are going on in our platform and in the world more generally. So in terms of the relationship with the clinician, I think it really varies on the condition to some extent. If you have quite a specialist condition like a neurological disease or a cancer or something like that, frequently you'll be dealing with a clinician who's often involved in research. And so I think they will take a keen interest in participant-led research. And my hope is that through sort of clinician interfaces to these patient platforms, whether it's PatientsLikeMe or somewhere else, I hope the clinician would use that tool to keep an eye on their patient or patients who are doing that. I think the other very important space we have to think about is where clinicians aren't that involved in research. If you think of primary care, for instance, if you as a relatively healthy person are dealing with something like insomnia or your blood pressure or your diabetes or your weight or something like that, you probably are already self-experimenting. You cut out caffeine, you take up running, you do whatever it is that you have to do. So there is some degree of self-experimentation already going on. And I think the question is, at what threshold do we need to start informing people about what we're doing, what we're experimenting with? I think certainly if you're using a drug, that crosses a clear threshold. But what about dietary changes? What about supplements? What about some levels of exercise? So yeah, I think there's probably a point at which we need to sort of either encourage patients to tell their clinicians or encourage clinicians to ask their patients, what else are you trying? we certainly know in cancer and in other neurological diseases that a fairly substantial minority of patients, around 15-20%, are taking off-label and complementary and alternative medicines and not telling their doctors. And in the case where that's, a multivitamin, that's one thing. In the case where it's St. John's wort or something that's psychoactive or could potentially, have an interaction with a prescribed drug, that's a serious issue there. So yeah, I think it's somewhat dependent on the condition, but we also have to be mindful of the clinician's attitudes to this. I think there are some things they can say that could potentially damage that relationship, and this may not be for everybody. I would predict that some clinicians will naturally attract patients who are willing to self-experiment, and other clinicians will say, no, I need to be able to control all the parameters, control the variables, because I am ultimately responsible for your health, and if you are going to self-experiment, then I'm not sure we're going to be able to work together on this. And that's a different model. That's saying that we're tackling this condition together. And I think most doctors that are forward-looking and progressive would think of the problem that way. And certainly people that work in terminal illnesses have been familiar with this for quite a while. So in terms of the challenges that we have to face, I think there's a few things that are common to all research projects. So one is bias. Certainly when we've compared the PatientsLikeMe sample, for instance, in multiple sclerosis, to a tertiary referral centre in Boston that sees thousands of patients, the group of people that self-report and join PatientsLikeMe tend to be younger, they tend to be more likely to be female, and they tend to be slightly better educated. But the important point is not to the extent that you might think. They're a couple of years younger. They're a few percentage points more likely to be female. They're not such a big bias that you can't override it either by stratified sampling or by sample weighting. So they are addressable. The other question is compared to what? We've looked at data in multiple sclerosis, we've looked at data in organ transplants, for instance, where in the United States, every organ transplant patient is catalogued, barcoded, and followed up in rigorous detail. But most diseases don't have that. So when someone says, well, is your population of patients with fibromyalgia biased? I've got 30,000 data points in our system. There are no other databases that large. So how do I know if I'm biased relative to the consecutive case series of 120 patients in the literature? Well, how do I know that they're not biased, that I'm not? It's very hard to tell. So that's one of the issues that we have to solve. The next issue is around the internet's classic problem. On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Well, on the internet, how can anyone be sure that you're a patient? You might have multiple sclerosis. You might think you have multiple sclerosis. You might not have multiple sclerosis, but you're trying to influence the community for some nefarious purpose, or just because you're messing around, who knows? And I think the degree to which we need to solve that depends on what problem we're trying to solve. If we're going for a very rigorous high-end question like, should a regulator or a payer decide whether or not this drug is worth approving, I think the data from which that comes has to be from people who've given some other level of verification they are who they say they are. That could be as high as their doctor has signed a form, or it might not have to get quite that extreme. I think as people's access to their medical records gets simpler, you could imagine them permissioning other systems to use that data. So in the same way that you have permissions around what the government can see about you, what your bank can know about you, or transfer to other banks under agreements like direct debit, for instance. You could imagine you being able to say, well, here are the conditions about me which I'm willing to share as data points with different bodies, whether that's universities or industry or whoever, and that you get some control over that. And that would allow us to upgrade the quality of the data, but for users and participants to retain that level of control. I think the third issue is just familiarity. The people that make decisions about diseases or about treatments or about health systems need to get more comfortable, more familiar with this data. And that's why I think it's very important to publish in the peer-reviewed literature, to publish open access where possible so that those aren't barriers to people reading things. And to get involved, to collaborate with other bodies so that they can try this out. So if you've worked in insurance claims data for 10 years, you know the ins and outs of that. And it's important then to try something out with a different data source, a real-world data source, which is messy, data-wise. It's certainly not as clean as a clinical trial, but it may be more generalizable. And I think that's another place where there's both a limitation but a potential strength. So data taken through online systems, digital systems, may or may not be generalizable depending on the condition. Those biases that I mentioned earlier don't do very well if what you're ultimately trying to study is, say, schizophrenia in people that are homeless. You're going to struggle to do that. But if your research questions around, working age women with multiple sclerosis, well, those demographics of younger and female actually work to your advantage. And so I think it's a question of picking out those populations where the bias and the generalizability can be addressed, and where the status quo, the databases and the samples are quite small. A big part of building a learning healthcare system is about building the correct measurements. We can only look after our weight because we have weighing scales and there are labels on our clothes that tell us how big we are. For most of the thousands of medical conditions that exist, there are no such measures like that. You can't line up a row of people from end to end and say, this is the person with the worst, say, autism or OCD, maybe not even depression, and say this is the person with the least worst, in such a way that is anywhere near as scientifically and psychometrically as rigorous as we can with, say, blood pressure or weight or height or anything that's more knowable from, say, physics. This can be addressed to some extent. There are patient-reported outcome measures where, through just questions and surveys, patients can tell us about their experience of disease, and that's particularly important around things like pain, about symptoms, about quality of life, or about the impact of disease on the activities of daily living. So perhaps we have an objective measure in something like rheumatoid arthritis from a blood test, but what we're really interested in is how well can you open a jar, how well can you function in the real world, and PROs really allow you to do that. The issue, however, is that there aren't many PROs. There's a ProQualid database that estimates there's a little under 1,000 PROs, and if there's about 7,000 diseases in ICD and about 7,000 rare diseases that don't even have names, according to Nord and Neurodis, then we need more measurements. The other issue is that many of these measurements were developed a long time ago, so they suffer from anachronisms. They say, how full of pep are you? They ask, in an Asperger's screening instrument, whether or not you can program a VCR, right? In this world of TiVos and DVRs, that's no longer relevant. So what we need is a way of developing PROs faster. We could also do with reducing limitations on them. Many of the PROs are licensed, copyrighted instruments. You have to pay, thousands of dollars for a license fee, or several dollars per use, and that limits their use. It restricts the use in innovation, in app development, say, and restricts them only to, say, expensive and well-funded clinical trials. So the point of the Open Research Exchange, and that's funded by a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, is to overlay a platform on top of PatientsLikeMe that allows researchers to come and enter in their prototype patient-reported outcome measures, and for patients on our system to come and help them improve them. So for instance, if there's a question around, say, how frequently do you experience suicidal ideation, we could target a patient that we know has had a mood disorder in the past to come and look at that question, and they might say something like, well, gosh, I don't know what ideation means. Do you mean, have I had thoughts about killing myself? That's a question that I can, relate to. And we can get more patients to look at that quickly, have the research iterate on that question, and then get another group of patients to come look at it and say, okay, do you notice any red flags? And so we can very quickly improve upon the individual questions. You could also field it to a larger sample of, say, a few hundred people who are willing to be volunteers, and you could more rapidly gather psychometric information. So we could say, through, say, item response theory, do we see enough segregation between the people saying not at all and a little bit or somewhat? Are these the right categories, or should we use 1 to 7 scale or 1 to 5 scale? There are psychometric statistical answers to that we frequently don't get in medicine because people don't have access to a sample that can try out one version with 5 items and one version with 7 items. But because these folks are online, they have the time to do that, they're willing to do that. So in 2013, the mission has been to develop 3 patient-reported outcome measures rapidly, and so far we're on track to achieve that in a number of different areas. All of those instruments will be licensed under Creative Commons share alike, which means that they can be built upon, translated, and what we're trying to build is an ecosystem around which PRO developers could come in and volunteer to help out other people. So if you have a statistical skill and a little bit of cognitive surplus spare time, or if you're a good item developer, you could help your peers. We could create item banks and libraries of instruments, so that if someone comes in, say a parent who's very well motivated, who wants to develop a PRO for their child who's got some developmental disorder that has some characteristics of, say, autism and Down syndrome or something else, we could take those items that have tested well and build that into a new scale. And because it's all under Creative Commons, we can reuse that work without having to worry so much about copyright. And then to build new instruments, and then perhaps someone else with a related condition wants to come along and build upon that scale. So it's kind of sort of an open library. Our software engineers talk about it as GitHub for PROs, which is a software development tool that allows a lot of open access work. And next year what we'll be looking at is trying to bring in more of those patients, more of those caregivers. So can we take this very complex task, which is PRO development, and by taking some of the workload off people through the software, allow more people to do that. And so, I'm not a cartographer, but I can use Google Maps. I'm a logistics expert, but I can use Amazon. When you let the software take off some of the heavy lifting, you're able to concentrate on what you actually want to do. And in this case, that would be share your experience of what it's like to live with a disease and give feedback to the researchers of what it's actually like to be a patient. My hope is that people will be open to some of these ideas, because who knows, one of our participant-led research projects could be right. It could be successful, and I think that much of the existing scientific endeavor is set up around new patentable pharmaceutical molecules. But in the case where it's exercise or diet or something like that, maybe even a behavioral modification, there's not a large, well-funded machine behind it that can go and study that. And so that means that we can miss out. And there are many conditions, diabetes is a perfect example, where those things can be just as effective, if not more so, without the side effects. But unless we build a system that captures that and allows it to sort of filter back into the medical system, it's going to remain just sort of a sideshow on the outskirts. So the next few years, I'm really expecting the governments of the world to wake up to this, for the health systems of the world to wake up to this, and start engaging a bit more with the problem. I think a lot of the participant-led research world has come from patients and participants, as you would expect. Frequently people who were, say, professionals in their working lives then get sick and sort of have come from a very high-tech environment like architecture or engineering or town planning, and they get ill and they're amazed that these systems don't exist, and so they go and build them. That's fantastic, that's great, it means they come from exactly the right place. But at some point these things need to scale, and they need to start interacting with the health system, and the health system is controlled by a variety of large players and big barriers to entry. And they are sometimes a little bit reticent to innovate. And so I think the opportunity here is to say, well, some of this work has been done. Some of the piloting work of where are the right conditions to engage in, who are some of the right people, some of the right technology platforms you can work in. I think some of these early barriers have been overcome by the pioneers, the patients out there in the field. And so I think now is the time for people that run hospitals or run decision-making bodies to say, well, okay, well, what are the sort of tendrils we can extend to see if we can link up here? Not to say, is it good enough yet, pass or fail, but to say, well, if these people did A, B, and C, then we would be able to use their data. Then we would be able to help involve them in the decisions more, and then we'd really be able to build in their system into ours and make use of that. And I think there are some places that are sort of looking at that within certain areas of medicine. I think certainly people with rare diseases have got a jump on this, because the parents are so well motivated, but also there are so few researchers sort of involved in this that really they're interested in all the help they can get. So people like the Alkaptonuria Society, AKU, have been extremely involved in building clinical databases of patients all over the world, sort of centralized out from the UK. They're helping to run trials. They've even funded the recent replication of a trial. When their funding gap of $100,000 showed up, they didn't just shut the trial down, they went out on Indiegogo and started fundraising through their researchers, through their communities, through their hospitals, in the same way as someone might kickstart a commercial project. So, I think there are some interesting new ways that you can sort of harness some of this stuff and build it back into the existing research infrastructure. One of the most pioneering groups in this field is the multiple myeloma group over in the States, who've actually worked very closely with the pharmaceutical industry and even funded pharma companies to develop drugs. Now, that is exactly the opposite way around of how we normally think of a non-profit or a charity. But they've taken a very aggressive approach in wanting to look at treatments that have potential and to say, well, even if there's maybe not an addressable market for this, we would like to make that investment from where we sit to try and make use of the pharmaceutical industry's existing infrastructure to do the science, to do the trials and to run those. And so I think we'll see a little bit more of that. So the existing infrastructure bringing in what's being done out there, and sometimes even inversions of how we normally think of the power dynamics. So I think those are the two big trends we see. I think the one trend I would love to see more of is where we see innovation in the developing world come through into the developed world, and there's a term reverse innovation, which I'm a bit ambivalent about. But the idea there is that you sort of look at interventions that are cheap, that could be open sourced. There's a great project called FITTLE, where there is an eye doctor in India who is 3D printing toys with Braille. And so you have something like a plastic fish, and it's shaped like a fish, and it's in 4 components, and it's got the Braille for F, I, S, and H. And he's open sourcing it so anyone can print it anywhere. And you sort of think this is a development that if a company came up with it, it would be very expensive and very complicated, and you have to order it from a catalog or what have you. But this philosophy is saying, no, if you've got a 3D printer, it's just intellectual property. You can just make it appear, and it just costs pennies for the plastic mold. And this sort of stuff is happening with prosthetics. It's happening with assistive devices. It's becoming easier and easier to do this. So I think that's a really important trend we have to look at. So innovation is not just spending millions of dollars on big expensive techno gadgets that go ping. Sometimes it's getting cheap little bits of plastic and wire and roping them together with a bit of know-how, and then distributing and assimilating that knowledge in a way that's low tech, survivable, robust, cheap, and that more and more people can have access to and can use.